I think we're underway. Hey everybody, I'm Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Nice to see you all. A couple different ways you can see us today. I presume for the 600 plus of you that have signed up, you're with us through the webinar technology at ReadyTalk. We'll talk about how to use that in a quick second. For those of you on Twitter, we are recording these proceedings there. You can follow them on Twitter at the hashtag ComNetLive, which is COMNETLIVE. And then for those of you who are really hung up on this Facebook thing that seems to be taking a hold.
Taking a hold, yeah.
It's taking a hold. We're on Facebook Live as well, and Kristen's already explained to me that I am not dressed properly for today's proceedings, so forgive me. And if you're curious, check out Facebook and you'll see how inappropriately I'm dressed. So anyway, thanks everybody for being with us for today's webinar, Mindful Messaging, Getting Inside the Brain of Your Audience. I'm joined by Kristen Grimm, who is not only a fashion consultant of mine, she's also the founder and president of Spitfire Strategies, and until about 2 minutes ago, I considered her a good friend.
Maybe I can regain.
Maybe. We'll see. We have an hour.
We have an hour.
She's obviously been at this for a very, very long time. I think Kristen is probably known to most of you. If not, you should make sure to get acquainted with her. She's been helping hundreds of social sector organizations tackle some of the very important issues that we're facing. You could probably name a dozen off the top of your head that have just cropped up over the last, 2 months we've been at this now.
Yeah.
But everything from online privacy to oil spills to, we're not going to put a name to what we're seeing, but the new, I wouldn't say normal, but the new thing that we're seeing here in Washington. Today, we're going to try to help you make a little headway, pun intended, by talking about mindful messaging, which focuses on not just who people are from a demographics perspective, but psychographically speaking. This is a fun word. Say that 3 times fast.
Right.
Why they do what they do. So a deeper dive into who people really are and how their values and lots of other things actually conspire to help them think about and make decisions that guide them in their lives. So over the next hour, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about how to think about your audiences, not just demographically, but psychographically. So what they think and what they do and what motivates them. How to message in a way that engages folks, right, and doesn't alienate them. That's really critical, because oftentimes we think we're doing good and we actually end up doing a little bit of harm. And how you can start to gather some information. You can actually, as it happens, you don't need a budget of $1 million to do this work, although that helps. But there is tremendous opportunity now in this new world that we live in to gather this information and put it to work for organizations. So before we get underway, just a couple quick logistical items. As I mentioned at the outset, we have 600 and some folks registered for this webinar, which means if you have a question, I promise we're going to do our darndest to get to it. If we don't, of course, you can send it to us through Twitter. I think Kristen would probably be more than happy to answer stuff offline or after we conclude here. But your questions, if you were on the webinar technology, you should be looking in your lower left-hand corner. You'll see I'm a terrible typist because I've got a couple typos in my first message to everybody. I'm big fingers. But suffice to say, type your questions in there, and we will be picking as many as we can and getting to them over the course of the hour. We're actually going to take a couple of times during the course of this hour to get to your questions. Again, on Twitter, hashtag ComNetLive. You see that. If you're on Facebook Live, you can see that behind us. And of course, as we always do, this webinar is being recorded, so we will make it available. It typically takes us about a week or so to turn this around, so look on comnetwork.org shortly for free replays. So thank you again for joining us, Kristen. I think this is where it says right there, hand off to Kristen.
I know that makes you nervous to give me all of your people for, upwards of 50 minutes. So
I'm a little scared, but the thing is, you already like the way I'm dressed, so I'm feeling good about that.
That's right. That's right. Well, I am really glad to be talking to you all about this today because I really started looking into this at the end of last summer. I constantly get social science in my inbox. I don't know about you, but all these studies and behavioral economics and, how people are thinking and what they're doing. And I would kind of read them, but I didn't necessarily do a whole lot with them. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting, but I wasn't really sure how to apply everything. And
just for folks who don't know you, let's just be really clear, you are not a scientist.
I am not a scientist. I am an Irish history major. Yes, that's right. So I have,
And you do communications work. That's what Spitfire Strategies does.
I do. That's exactly right, because, the gift of the gab.
But you're enjoying the social sciences these days.
Suddenly I was flooded with them, and I was sort of like, I think as a communicator, I'm supposed to actually do something with them other than read them and occasionally post them on Twitter. And so I really got serious about it last October, and maybe I should have done it a little sooner so that November didn't happen. But I was really struck by 2 things. And if you see on the screen, when people talk about have government keep their hands off my Medicare, and I'm like, hello, like, do you not know that that is the government? But then also, I heard a lot of people saying, and confession, I have also said, why are people acting against their own self-interest? And I find myself saying that more and more. And then I really wanted to get reflective about it, and maybe I didn't actually know what people's self-interest is. And I think that that was an important place to start. My first inquiry was, maybe I'm not so sure what people's self-interest is, and maybe I better figure that out. So to kind of bring us into it, so famous neuroscientist from Nielsen is Carl Marcy. And he really reminds us of an important thing for us to keep in mind when we're going to be doing messaging. And that is that for most of us, we message as if people are completely rational. And as Carl's pointing out here, in fact, we're almost always emotional and only occasionally rational. So it suggests that we're really approaching it in the wrong way. And another social scientist named Lisa Fazio, she spoke recently and issued a paper about the illusory truth and kind of like why do people believe fake things, which seems important to realize right now.
Really?
But her thing, yes, you should look it up. It's a thing. But really right now, the interesting thing is that she wants to remind us that our brains really don't want to work very hard. Their entire job is to try and save energy and save time. And this is why, you walk to work the same way every day. Or like when you go to bed, you're not every night thinking like, which side should I sleep on? You just go to bed.
Or you put on a black sweater for a nice event.
That's right, because you're like, I wear black every day. You should think about that. So, but the point is, this idea is that the brain is lazy. And so then we have to really understand, so the brain's using all sorts of shortcuts all the time, and that means when they're hearing our messaging. So what are those shortcuts going on? So I really wanted to take a look at that, and I came at this from, instead of looking at it as if everybody has this incredibly orderly brain where everything's really rational and I can totally tell, like, my message is going to enter here and go here, I in fact started to look at it more like the brain is a pinball machine, and it's a little out of control, and the ball goes out there, and sometimes it dings and lights up, and I get points, and sometimes it makes a horrible sound, and it goes, and then I lose it and I have to start all over again. And that does feel a little bit more like how messaging is working. So today what I really want to talk through is that I tried to say, okay, so what's a methodical way that I as a communicator could take this boatload of social science research and apply it to my challenges here. So first I'm really going to talk about really getting to know your audience. And I know I have been on, as many people have, a tirade about segmenting your audiences and having an audience, but I'm really going to talk about what you need to know about them today. Then I'm really going to talk about, well, how do you get a handle on what's at play? Like, what pinball game are you playing? Are you playing the KISS pinball machine? Are you playing the, like, Homer Simpson one? Because that's really going to matter. Third, then I want to show you some examples of people who I think are doing a really good job of keeping in mind about how messaging is bouncing around in the brain, and they're actually getting better results than those of us who are a little like, let's use luck. And then last, of course, I always want to be talking about, well, how do you assess and evolve it? Because that really matters is, are you actually having traction? So let's start with really getting to know your audience and this idea that for many of us, when I look at our audience segments, they are in fact paper dolls. They're very thin, kind of one-dimensional, and there's a real problem with that. So we look at everything from demographics. So let's take a look at this fellow. So we can sort of say some things about him. He is probably white. That's maybe an assumption, right? He's older. He's a man. We don't know a whole lot else, but that's the demographic data we can pick out from him. But when we step back and we say, well, let's understand a little bit more about him in context, suddenly, A, he's driving a really old pool car. He seems to be enjoying the outdoors, and he's a dog owner. And we happen to know if you're a dog owner, you make decisions really differently than people who are not dog owners. For example, you cannot leave the house for more than 8 hours. So already I know a lot more about him.
He's not wearing socks.
He's not wearing socks, and we know that that says a lot. So suddenly, because I understand a lot more maybe psychographically how this man is in the world, it completely changes a lot about what I'm going to do. And here is the main point I want to make for people working on causes. This applies to people buying things, but I think it rings true for causes. And that is, on average, less than 2% of brand choice is explained by demographics. That means if you're only relying on demographics, then 98% of the reason why people are doing a certain thing is totally a mystery to you. So we need to pay a lot closer attention to psychographics. And there's a ton of psychographics you can look at. These are people's beliefs, attitudes, opinions, etc. But what I tried to do was to focus on a few psychographics that I see at play a lot when you're talking about engaging people on social issues. So let me take a closer look at a few of these to give you a sense of what I mean. So the first is this idea of worldview. So worldview is how people view the world, and we've been hearing about this a lot lately. How people view the world. Is the world a friendly place? Is the world a scary place? Is the world full of abundance? Is the world a place of great scarcity? This really shows up in how people behave in the world as to what their worldview is. And there was a really big study about, are wealthy people actually more generous than people who don't have as much money? And they largely found out no. And what they found out was that people who'd made their own money had this real autonomous view of the world, a lot of agency, but they thought they were very independent. They were not interconnected. So therefore, they could kind of do what they wanted to do. They didn't really have for others, versus people who didn't have as much money, and they regularly on a daily basis were relying on other people to kind of make ends meet and get along in the world. They had a very communion idea, and they are in fact much more generous to help out people who need help. So that was a really interesting view, is that if you're trying to go after donors, for example, suddenly that worldview really matters. If they're autonomous and what you might be messaging to them versus are they kind of a communion mindset. Once you know their worldview, you can also start to see, well, and who are they in that world? What are their badges? So I might say, I'm a feminist. You might say, you're a goth because you like to wear black. But all of us have badges, right? What we are. We might be foodies. We might be micromanagers. I personally am a backseat driver. So some of our badges are good, some of them are not, but the point is this is how I show up in the world. We also have then tribes, and these are the people we travel around the world with. So the communication network is a tribe. We are communicators, and we belong to this group. And many of us belong to a number of different tribes. But the important thing to know is that generally speaking, we're walking around the world trying to reinforce our worldview, because it makes us feel comfortable. We're trying to reinforce who we think we are in the world, and that people know who we are, and we're trying to stay and belong to the people we think we belong to. So when you're messaging and you're trying to screw around with people's badges or their tribes, like you're going to find out that people suddenly, and this is where you hear, like people will literally deny scientific facts in order to stay with their tribe if their tribe does not acknowledge that as fact. And we're seeing that more and more. And the last thing that I want to have people pay attention to here is this idea of polarization. Because of course many of the issues we work on get polarized, which feeds into about your tribe and your badge and your worldview. So here we have an example of guns. And anytime you say gun, if you are a gun owner and you really, really, really worship the Second Amendment, then any conversation, even if it's about gun violence or even locking up your guns, which might seem sensible, people can suddenly feel very polarized about it and think you have a hidden agenda. Or they go to a place where they're suddenly feeling very emotional about their right to bear an arm. And it is more difficult to have rational conversations when they've been triggered and polarized. See, I used the pun too. Okay. So it's that kind of webinar. So those two are really important. The next three are also really important, and the first is implicit bias. And this is this idea that I told you, we want to have shortcuts and we want to be able to make decisions very quickly. So a lot of what we rely on are things we believe and are hunches for us. And these are even things that a lot of times in a focus group we will not own up to. We'll be like, we're completely fair. I don't discriminate against anybody. I don't think anybody is lesser than me. But then you watch somebody walking around the world and you see that in fact they have implicit bias. And a really interesting study I saw recently is an implicit bias that many people hold, which is that healthy food is very expensive and cheap food is very tasty. Now this to me is a huge problem because I work on issues where I'm trying to get people to eat healthy. So this implicit bias does not help me because one, it gives people an excuse, which is I can't afford to eat healthy, so they buy and eat less healthy foods. But also this idea of tasty is a problem because now it seems like a sacrifice when I have to go eat healthy. So, and then I have to think about, well, where am I reinforcing this? So you think about where we talk about food deserts and things like that, and you realize that what we're talking about is living in a place where you can't afford healthy food. So we're actually reinforcing this bias that's actually not that useful. So for me, working on food deserts, it makes me pause and think, oh, I probably don't want to actually talk about it that way anymore because I don't want this to continue. I actually want to disrupt this bias and make people think that healthy food is in fact tasty and they can afford it. So how can I do that? The other thing to realize, and it kind of relates to this because you've certainly had healthy food that doesn't taste good and cheap food that's actually quite tasty, is your lived experience will trump many things. So no matter what the data says or the fact says, if your lived experience is different than that, you will believe your own eyes. And keep in mind, your own eyes extends to your tribe. So if my tribe is experiencing this, and we see this out there in the world, if you are an African-American male right now, you are experiencing police brutality, and if you see people like you having police brutality, it is as if you're experiencing it. And it can feel the same way to the police who are feeling like they are getting stigmatized and they are having, and you're seeing everybody really pull in to their groups. because of lived experience, that even if it didn't happen exactly to them, it happened to somebody like them that they really relate to. And the last one here that's super important to consider if it has any impact on your issue is this idea of habit. Habit, again, is that idea of the brain doesn't want to think. I don't want to think really hard about what side of the bed I sleep on. I just want to hop in bed. So habits, if you want to change someone's behavior, you have to understand if they're doing it and it's a habit, you're going to have to disrupt the habit. So a good example of a study was if you really want to stop your staff, my staff, I have the candy closet right near my area. People come back in the afternoon. They're probably back there right now because it is unsupervised. And they're regularly getting into the cabinet. But if I didn't want them to do that, if I wanted them to go to the fruit, which is in the kitchen, I would have to actually disrupt the candy cabinet. So this study found that for people who love to keep candy on their desk, if you want to eat less candy, the sort of 2 o'clock hour hits, you look up, your bowl is there, that's your signal, get a candy. If you just put that jar in the drawer and you change that they have to go open the drawer, it actually changes their habit. And so these are the kinds of things you need to think about is why is this person making this decision? It may not be as well thought out as you think. It may in fact just be a habit. So these are the kind of psychographic information that you think, wow, if I knew more about my audience, if I knew these types of things, I could actually message in a much more sophisticated way. And you can get this kind of information all over the place. Like when we try and think about, well, what do I think their stereotypes are and their social norms are? Where are they getting a lot of their attitudes and beliefs? And it's from all over the place. You can look at their media consumption. This is just looking on popular television shows. So this is in urban areas, this is what they're watching. So what urban areas think about family might be different because they're watching Modern Family versus in rural areas where we find out that they're watching Duck Dynasty. Like, what does that say about what is getting invited into their living room on a regular basis and reinforcing either their worldview, their badges, their tribes, those implicit biases? And keep in mind that what people are seeing on a screen, either through news or through popular television, is lived experience because they've seen it with their own eyes. So all of these things are inputs that are shaping how they think about the world, what their attitudes are, what their opinions are. You can also use social media to go in and listen. The California Healthcare Foundation, which has been working to try and reduce unnecessary C-sections, did this. They really went into all those chat rooms and the places that soon-to-be moms are talking about what kind of delivery they want. And they're able to categorize what conversations they're already having to try and figure out the best, most authentic ways to get in there, influence it, try and figure out how they can deal with these folks' beliefs and how they're talking about these issues and who they're listening to in a really sophisticated way. And so if you're doing this really well, you would end up with a much fuller picture than, again, we saw when we put up the guy in the first place where I said, well, he might be white and he's definitely older and he's male, and that was all I knew. If you look at something like this, which is a group that wanted to get young people to stop or never start smoking, you really see a huge difference between when they say country and they say, well, these are young adults, who really are quite close with their family and community, and they have strong family values, and they're very patriotic. That's a really interesting word. It hits me really funny when I think about patriotic. Like, that says a lot. Versus a hipster who actually is really all about individuality and creativity. They're in a really different place than the country people. So how I'm going to get the country people to not smoke is very different than how I'm going to get the hipsters to not smoke. So because I understand a lot more psychographically about them, though, I'm going to be able to come up with much better messaging. Now you may wonder, how do I get this? Well, I have good news and bad news. It's everything from absolutely free to fantastically expensive. So free because we're living in the age of big data. The truth is I can go after the census is available to all of us. It has unbelievable information, and we're about to get a bunch more through the new census. There's also just freely available reports. I mean, tap in like millennials, and you will get tons of people who want to share their reports. You also have big research centers that put things up for free, like the Pew Research Center has tons of stuff about different people's behaviors and attitudes and views over long periods of time. And you even have a lot of companies like Zipcar who are just sharing regularly, and the truth is if you have affinity with certain companies, like if you work on environmental issues, you should go and be asking Patagonia, who does enormous amounts of research, or REI, and it's entirely likely they will just share that information with you, and you can get a lot of information about the people who are shopping with them that may help you on the issues. Now you can get into kind of cheap. So Facebook Insight is by far one of the very best things. You can go in for free. You can figure out the kind of audiences you're interested in, and literally using Facebook Audience Insight, you can actually figure out everybody else on Facebook who's like that and what they are like. And so what's interesting about that is you're talking about, 1.3 billion people. So if you're worried about sample size, don't worry about it. Experian and Nielsen, they have, super pay for, but they also have a lot of low cost and free platforms as well. Going to research firms that do a lot of work in the area, whether it's they're doing it as consumers, they're doing it as voters, you can call them up and ask them for $1,000. They will tell you, like, over the last year, all of our studies, here's a compilation, couple of pages on it. And then Google Consumer Surveys is something you can field yourself for as low as $500, and you can get it out there and ask questions of your audience. So then, of course, you get into much more comprehensive data sets. You can do qualitative inquiry. You can load up somebody in a car, have them go across the Rust Belt, or going all the way to the fantastically expensive, where you're talking about both qualitative and quantitative proprietary data sets. And, of course, now you're talking very expensive, $250,000. But if you're a funder who is funding an entire field, say, $250,000 is going to allow the entire affordable housing field might be completely well worth it. So, and certainly better than flying blind, because as I said, I want to go back to, if most decisions are getting made and 2% of that decision is influenced by demographic and everything else is psychographic, I'd pause if I didn't have a lot of psychographic data and I was asking for people to change. So let me just take a pause here, Sean, to sort of see if anybody had any question that's burning right now, or if I can continue on.
Looks like we have a couple, so let's take a swing at a few of these. Diana asks, how do you match the lower cost options for data with your own audience? In other words, what's the best, I think if I understand you right, Diana, what's the best choice here? If I want to spend $500 and do a survey from Google, or I want to get something free available through, let's say, Facebook Insights. How do I know what the right tool is to use? And how would I match census data, for example, with my supporter files? So in other words, how do I do that last little, how does that last mile come together?
Yeah. So if you're looking at your own group and you say, I have these activists or I have these members and this is sort of who they represent right now. This is my set of millennials and they're urban and they're here, and this is my set of more middle-aged and they're rural and they're here. You can take those and say, well, how many more of there are there? And that's where census really comes in, is to say, gosh, I could go and find out, well, how many millennials are within urban areas in this age group that are college educated? Census is going to give you that. So suddenly you might say, I'm only reaching less than 1% of that millennial group. I actually have a much larger market. And you can think about, do I want to grow my activist base or my donor base or whatever in that market? So to me, I would always start with free, because I'm trying to figure out what the size of my market might be, because immediately that might tell me really double down on this market.
Let's just pause right there, because this is a word for some folks in the social sector that feels like a bad word when you use the word market.
Yes.
Right? People get a little, some of you guys get a little upset when you hear the word brand or the word marketing. I'll say this for you. Get over yourselves. Okay? Get over yourselves. You're trying to do some good in the world. Use whatever advantage you can to kick people in the knees if you need to. This stuff works.
Well, I'm gonna do a live demonstration for Sean. So instead of saying get over yourself, where you just basically, alienated your audience, the pinball machine just went, lost them all. But I would say this is that right now, a lot of the data that you're seeking is actually going to be found in this type of lingo. Mm-hmm. So if you can sort of understand that this is in a large part how different people engage with people, and they talk about them as segments and markets. It'll just be easier for you when you're looking at this stuff to be able to compare apples to apples. Am I looking for that? So I would tell people, embrace this idea that a lot of people are gathering information and they'll call it marketing data. So don't look at it and be like, oh, I don't want marketing data. You do want that data. They're talking to you. They're saying, I have information about these audiences you'd like to get to know better. Great. But I would always start cheap, because I do find that if you can set up your questions well, like I need to know how millennials are choosing whether or not to own something, because maybe I'm working on affordable housing. Now I can go to the Pew Research Center and find out, well, what do they know about millennials? Well, are they actually talking to them about the share economy? And maybe they're not, in which case then these things are not tons of reports. I don't need to read them because they're not dealing with this issue. Versus I might go to Zipcar, which is free, and they do have a lot on the share economy. So, and I might even want to call them on the phone and talk to them, because they like to talk to do-gooders, is the nice thing. And then I can get my answer. And I would certainly start there before I went at all higher, because it's so frustrating when you go and you pay for something and then realize, oh my God, it was just sitting there at my fingertips. So a little bit of research really can help you. And what I wouldn't be afraid of is asking someone who's good at research or landscape research to do it for me. Because for some of you, you might be like, oh, and then I went into a rabbit hole of 20 hours looking at the Pew Research Center, whereas people who are good at research are going to do that for about an hour and come back to you and say, here are the 15 things that are applicable. Tell me if I'm on the right track. So you can spend your money wisely there.
All right, there's a bunch of questions here. You guys are really engaged with this. This is awesome. I am going to go with, this is Lana. I'm interested in how this type of understanding of our audiences can also help us create identity with something new. So, for example, if we're trying to establish some sort of community that we want lots of different people to join, how could you use psychographics to help bring people into this space?
Yeah. Well, you're going to see that I have a really interesting example where somebody's doing just that, because a lot of what psychographics can also tell you is where do you actually find that you have common ground that maybe you're not doing. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, when they were working on obesity a lot, they need to get different people really involved in it to kind of increase the urgency with which this nation dealt with it. And finally what they realized was that people who are not fit couldn't fight. So they suddenly had a lot in common with the military. And so suddenly, they had a lot of people saying that the reason we needed to get on top of this epidemic was that a lot of kids were growing up and they were too unfit to fight. And so that's a really important thing for them to have realized, that was a huge power player to get involved in the obesity thing. And it was through psychographics that you understood by going and talking to the military and saying, hey, is there anything about this obesity epidemic that's concerning you? That didn't seem so natural. But suddenly it was like, right, it's not so much that they just want them to be fit for being well. They need them to be fit to fight.
Yeah, employees.
Yeah, and a lot of people were failing that test. So it was just a great example of going and figuring out something that was a concern to them when you were talking about your issue.
Gotcha. There are a lot of questions. Thank you all. We'll keep going. Why don't we move on? We'll keep going, and we'll come back to some of these towards the end.
Terrific. So let's pretend that you now know psychographically and demographically who you actually want to engage. So now you have to sort of sit down and say, okay, so there's all this social science research, and what I need to figure out is which of it might be at play in this audience that I'm trying to engage with. So a great example here comes from this Harvard professor, Professor Juma, where reminds us that we overestimate the risks of change. So we don't actually like change. And you're sort of seeing this. We didn't like the ACA because it was change, and now we don't like it, but they're going to change it back. Basically, we just don't like change. And interestingly, we also don't like change, and we underestimate the risk of doing nothing. So when you look at this around solar, these things, you regularly hear people say things like, but how am I going to get power when it's a cloudy day? And you kind of want to be saying, like, how are you going to get power when the Earth is destroyed? Like, that's actually the bigger question, right? But that's not how they're not looking ahead and saying, oh, if I don't change anything, I'm actually hurtling into, like, the end of time. Instead, it's like, well, next week when it's raining, am I going to be able to get power? But if you understand that they overestimate this immediate change, and they underestimate that if they don't do anything, then nothing else will happen, it actually helps you to think about how to message them, right? So important to do. So let's take a look at what some people have been able to really understand what's going on. So coming back to guns, we sort of see here kids playing with condoms, which is always good and attention getting. And you see that actually what this communication is about is, hey, always lock up your guns. Now it's really important that they don't have two kids here playing with guns. Because what they did was they said, we need to get people to do this, but because we want them to lock up their guns, it means they have guns. So it's likely that they're going to have the worldview that they have a right to have a gun. So I'm going to acknowledge that they have a worldview with the Second Amendment is sacred. And what I don't want to do is have to kind of make them think I'm going after that in any way. So I'm going to not have guns in this ad. I'm going to put up something else, condoms. And I'm also going to think about, what are some universal truths, and this is to the question that we just got. Where can I find that common ground? So whether you're a gun owner or a person who has sex, there is a universal truth, which is if kids find it, they will play with it. And even as I say it, some of you might be remembering a dinner party or other time when your kid came out wearing something or brandishing something that they really shouldn't have. And you thought to yourself, I should lock that up. So you're having that memory, because this is a universal truth, is that kids will play with it. And now I can connect that to the gun. But they did this in such a way that they were really able to acknowledge the worldview that's at play here and not walk right into that buzzsaw and turn off the audience that they in fact want to engage on this. And here's one where you have people who are not making ends meet. This happens to be in Durham in North Carolina. But when you start to think about, people who can't make ends meet, people who struggle economically, they need help, they are using government services, they need community services, but you got a couple things going on here. People need stuff all the time, and so we're hearing about it a lot. So one, you have compassion fatigue, and especially when you put up things like 6,000 people. It's not one person. I'm not really connecting with them. There's a lot of people. I'm starting to get judgmental, like, why can't they make ends meet? Are they not working? But part of that's my compassion fatigue. There's just so many things coming at me. I have to be so concerned about so many things. I'm just kind of tired. I want to rationalize away that I need to do anything. The other thing is it's not necessarily touching me personally. These 6,000 people, again, I don't know who they are. It's a very depersonalized issue. So interestingly, what these folks have done is it's a game. If you click on this and go to try and prove it, you will find out, like I did, that in basically 3 days, I also cannot make ends meet. And so they just remind you that through life circumstances, you could find yourself here, and it's not so great, and just it could happen to anybody. And so that is a way to kind of cut through the compassion fatigue and the depersonalization, really important. So they know what's at play here, compassion fatigue, and people have depersonalized this issue, so you can have communication that come back to it. So the person who asked me the common ground question, I thought this was pretty brilliant. So CPAC was recently in town, so this is a very conservative group here to talk about their policies and their national agenda. And they at their conference, they really do other gay people. They're anti-gay in a lot of ways. Their platform's very anti-gay. There's a lot of rhetoric down there. It's alarming. But interestingly, in their hotel rooms at night, they're not so anti-gay. So the gay community here in Washington, D.C. actually geofence. So that means they literally have ads surrounding the hotel where these people were. And they reminded them that, like, hey, you can't be against us during the day and with us at night. So they're trying to remind them, like, hey, we actually do belong to the same tribe. So, you really shouldn't be doing that during the day. You're outside the tribe. So they're trying to disrupt the othering that's going on. So to me, this is a very creative way of doing it, and at least probably made some people pause and think about it. This one is around the vaccine for HPV, which most people probably know is the thing that causes most cervical cancers. And when they went to go look at it, even though it's been readily available for years, you have as few as 22% of boys getting it. And that's a pretty small number when you think about that this is now a preventable cancer. So they've had these very in-your-face ads running right now where a girl at about 25 has cervical cancer, and she's like, but you didn't know that I could get cervical cancer, right. And what they're trying to do is actually deal with this issue, which is that doctors and parents, when you go and you ask them, they don't want to talk about sex with a 10 or 11-year-old girl. They just don't. And so they're thinking that that's too big a risk and they don't want to take it. So this ad is saying, well, do you want to have the conversation at 25 when they have cancer that you could have prevented it? Like, which one of these is going to be more uncomfortable? So what they're really acknowledging here and is at play is they really, really, really don't want to talk about sex. So we have to create something that actually makes it even worse. And we'll see how that plays out. But really good thing. Many of us saw this number. So 53% of white women voted for Trump. So for those people working on progressive issues, they're kind of wondering, like, what does this mean? And one thing that they're saying, the analysts are saying, is that gender played a lower role than class and culture. So we'll have to think about that. For the progressive issues you're working on, don't count on it that going in and talking about equal pay coming from a gender lens is necessarily going to work with this group. That's not to say other groups that doesn't work with, but this group you're going to have to pay attention to, well, what's the issue of culture and class? And think about that instead. Here's a group that is trying to really get religious people involved in predatory lending. And what I thought was really interesting was how they asked the questions. And so for the person who asked about, like, where do you want to go and find information, this is one where I might try and go get proprietary data. There's not necessarily going to be a lot of data about religious views on lending necessarily. But what was fascinating here was what they found was a real opportunity, which is not only that it's a bad thing, it's a sin. And so suddenly you're right in somebody's worldview, with their badge, with their tribe, if you can now connect this issue to it is a sin. So this would be a big thing you'd want to take advantage of in finding out that research. And this one was really interesting to me recently. There's a lot of this aid in dying. So that's like when you're coming to your last days, can you have help? Can you get drugs? Can you just make it more comfortable, not die in a hospital room, but really be in control? And they found that actually a lot of African Americans are very against this. And one of the reasons why is when they went and asked them in this qualitative inquiry, they found out that African American residents here in D.C. would actually start talking about what actually happens, like who's in control. They don't feel like they would be in control. They feel like this would be an excuse for the government to do things. And they mention things like Tuskegee. So you realize they have this lived experience, this historical lived experience that is still alive today, and they are applying to the situation, and it makes them very against this. So you're going to have to figure that out rather than just going and talking to them about, like, you're totally going to be in control. They're like, you are lying. Like, that is not what's going to happen, and that is not how it's happened before. So really important insights to help you understand what's at play here. So what's at play is a hard thing. It's more of an art than a science, even though there's a ton of science. So this is a great example of here are a bunch of cognitive biases that people face, from stereotyping, to short-termism. And you can put this stuff on your wall, and you can hopefully diagnose what might be going on with your audiences. But the point is, if you don't spend some time thinking about this, you will just make mistakes. You're not understanding how people's brains are working, and it's just not as simple as saying, here's my message, and as if they're just a complete blank slate. They, in fact, are chock full of attitudes, biases, opinions that you have to keep in mind. So let me pause there before I inspire you with people navigating these opportunities and challenges to see if people have questions about how do you figure out what's at play with your audience.
John has a good question. Let's start right there. What are a couple of examples of psychographic questions you might ask if you were doing a survey or doing a focus group or an interview? Just to give me an example, what would that look like as opposed to a demographic question?
Yeah. So I might ask, like, what makes you think about going to vote? What was the thing that really helped you decide whether or not you were going to support a candidate? When you think about volunteering for a cause, what's the first cause that really is of concern to you? What was the last cause you actually did volunteer for? Because you might find that what they say they would do and it really cares about is different when you find out, oh, they've been, really spending a lot of time on a disease that they didn't mention in the first question, and you might find out that that's because their best friend has that disease. So you're really trying to understand how they're making decisions about their time, their money, their power. When was the last time you did a consumer boycott? What was it on? Try and understand how they feel empowered as people. When you think about what you read online, what kind of opinions are really popular in your Facebook posts. You'll sort of figure out, well, who are their friends and what are they being exposed to a lot? So these are the types of questions that I think can help you understand who they think they are. Might even ask them, like, what are some badges you wear around the world? And they'll talk about, like, I'm a road warrior, or, and they'll tell you about who they think they are. And then you can see, and how does that play out in your life? Like, do you belong to groups with road warriors? Are you, what goes on there? Like, I have a lot of hotel points, So you can really start to riff off of that to understand who they are and then how that actually impacts them and how they behave in daily life.
Gotcha. Shireen asks, hey Shireen, how do you figure out which psychographics are the most important categories to organize your personas around? So what's the most, Shireen, I think, is working on women and national security issues. How would she figure out, well, it's really great to know that people like pizza, but that's probably not going to ultimately get folks who are women working in international security issues excited. I mean, they might get excited about pizza, but it's probably not going to motivate to work with Shireen.
Yeah. So, and I did pick those psychographics that I highlighted for you all based on the ones I think are most at play. So certainly worldview. Do they think national security is important? Are they a hawk? Are they a dove? Like, that's really going to help you to understand where they are. Do they think the United States is being strong in the world? Do they think there's a lot of threat out there? Do they actually think there's a lot of diplomacy out there? These kinds of things are really going to be at play in how they view national security. The other thing is when you're trying to get, if it's audiences that aren't always as associated with that issue, so women oftentimes are not associated with national security. It's an issue female candidates fight against a lot, is that they have competency with national security and in good, well-formed perspective. You might also ask women how they feel about that. How do they feel as women to be empowered on this issue? Because it might not just be that, oh, do I know a lot about this issue? Like, what do you know about it? Are you reading about it daily? Are you engaging with neighbors and professional colleagues around it? You're sort of understanding if they have a well-formed opinion about it, which is different than, do I act on that opinion? Have I called a member of Congress about it? Have I had discussions? Do I belong to groups that regularly meet and talk about foreign affairs in a public forum? Because it will tell you their competence level. So you're sort of looking at worldview, their competency with the issue, their confidence in the issue, because all of these things will play into the psychographics in that instance.
Gotcha. look at one more, and then we'll move forward. Emily asks, are there any processes or set questions that you ask yourself as you're developing a communications campaign? So with Spitfire, you're obviously doing this work.
Right.
This is a big component of how you're thinking about things. How do you get started?
So if I'm looking at a campaign, and I'm assuming you mean an advocacy campaign and not a behavior campaign. So
let's say an advocacy campaign for our purposes.
So for the advocacy campaign, I'm going to define the win. I'm going to say this is the win. And then I'm going to need to know these are the groups of people that are going to have to do these things for me to win. Now I've got my segments. I've got to get these people to do this thing. And I am going to look at them in segments and then say, so what is going to make them do those things? So now I'm going to get to know them. Psychographically, where are they? How are they feeling about this issue? Is this like a comfortable thing for them, an uncomfortable thing for them? Is this a hard ask? Are they convinced already and they're ready to act? Is it that they are totally unmotivated? They're sitting on the back. There's a thing called social loafing that I've been reading a lot about, like somebody else will take care of it. What will get them basically to engage and get on the playing field and move down the field? So I'm really looking for those motivations, and then I want to know what's at play. What's at play that's really going to motivate them to do it? What are those barriers that are coming at them that is going to make them not want to take action or wait till someone else takes action? A lot of times what I notice about people when they do audiences is we treat them as if, okay, I've got 4 segments, I'm going to approach all 4 at once. And the truth is, if I layered it differently, I could make them like dominoes, where as different audience engage, they would actually create the momentum for the other audiences. And sometimes what happens is actually I put audiences out that alienate some audiences from getting involved. So again, if I want to go in and talk about the Gulf Coast and how conservation is so important and it's a real economic driver, and I put conservationists out there first making that message, I can actually alienate the businesses. Whereas if I put the businesses out first, I can pull in the conservationists later and add them as a cherry on top. So you do want to think about not your audiences as all going all at the same time, but also which one should go first that actually create momentum for you rather than create suddenly that polarization, which you really don't want.
Gotcha.
All right?
Keep going forward.
All right. So we know what's at play, so now we have to say, okay, so how can I make the most of it? So this is a great example. You all know I will not talk about the example because I know we've all read it, but you're kind of like, this is the ALS, this is the Ice Bucket Challenge. And everybody, I figured it was a sweater, you're probably like, I want to get wet. So,
I don't today.
Yeah.
Let's not do that right now.
So a bunch of people threw ice on their head, and you would think like, well, this is a disease a lot of people don't have. How do they make that happen? And this just totally became a social currency thing. It was a thing that everybody was doing. Your friends asked you, you wanted to say you did it, you wanted to post it on your Facebook page. So social currency is a really great thing that they did really well. This is an example of a good group, WASI. They actually work on healthcare internationally. So they work in developing worlds. As you know, as soon as something's very far off, it is harder to get people to pay attention and to do things. They were getting millennials to do it, and they did a couple of really interesting things. One, you see Meet the Patient. They're actually making it really personal. This is called telescoping. So unlike that 6,000 people in Durham, which immediately starts to trigger compassion fatigue, say Meet the Patient. Oh, I can go meet this patient. Then it says you can fund their care. I'm actually going to fund them directly for as little as $5. So again, that deals with this social loafing, which is, oh, I'm sure, $5 isn't going to matter. They're looking for 100. They're telling you, like, low cost of admission here, your actions really matter. So they're getting over that hump of like, but will it really make a difference? Also for millennials, you'll find out if you Google those millennial reports that are free out there, they love radical transparency. They want to know how their money was spent. Is that patient better? So you can actually get an update on that patient. So this, for the millennial, they really built around everything that was going on with them, and you can see that they've actually had tremendous luck with them. Why doesn't my thing come up? Oh, there we go. Hi. So again, one thing I mentioned is that when things are far away, we have 2 issues. We're really easy to discount both in time and distance as if things matter less because of that. And we're really into short-termism. Like we really like to look at what's right in front of us. So this is a good example that Amnesty was able to do. These are on bus stops and in train stations, and it says, this isn't happening here, but it is happening now, and you see a child soldier. So you're really bringing it to the person. It is happening right now. So you are closing the distance, both physically closing the distance, viscerally closing it, and in time you are closing it for people. So very smart solution to that problem. This is back to that group that figured out people thought it was a sin They started calling it GraceBased Lending, which is really interesting as opposed to the predatory lending that was going on. But what I also thought was really interesting, in addition to fitting the worldview of people trying to say this is good lending, this is the kind of way lending should happen, they talked about predatory lending, and that when they shared with them what was happening, they talked about it, they all react in disgust. So actually the messaging that they were using triggered an incredibly strong emotional reaction that is in fact very empowering. Disgust is something that will make you act. And so that was a really good solution to that. Here we see the traffic and the road safety people. They realized as they were really looking at what's at play in people's brain that when you called it an accident, it took the control away and it took the judgment away. So when you called it an accident, they were like, oh, it's just God. Well, most accidents are not, in fact, just not in control. It's because people are texting, people are drinking. They are crashes. They are intentional. Someone is responsible. So they've really spent a lot of time asking people to not use accident anymore and to use crash. And crash, again, gives you that visceral sense. It does make people judgmental. Well, who was at fault because of the crash? And you're able to move public policy behind it because of the way you're talking about it, as opposed to an accident, which is, well, it could happen to anybody, right? That's the universal truth of an accident. And you really want to move away from that about how that's playing out in people's heads. Two more examples here, and then we can take some questions about this. So some of y'all might have heard about down in Georgia, they were going to sign a religious freedom bill, which would have been quite discriminatory. And people like Netflix, who do a lot of production down there, it's big, they're a big economic engine down there. They came out with a statement that said Netflix is an inclusive company, and that if this gets put into place, we like Georgia, but we're going to move out if there's discriminatory practices down here. And interestingly, everybody followed. The NFL said they would move the Super Bowl. CBS said they would pull out. All sorts of people followed because of two things. One, Netflix put up its badge. We're an inclusive economy. Then there were a bunch of companies who were like, oh, we're in the inclusive tribe. Like if one of our leaders is out there saying they're out of Georgia, then we're out of Georgia because that's what inclusive companies do. So they really used that badge and tribe thing really well and very quickly, as y'all might recall, that happened.
Let's pause on that for one quick second, because I actually think this is an important point for a lot of our friends in the foundation space. Tribes are incredibly powerful, right? And this is a place where I think a lot of foundations struggle. Sometimes don't recognize the power of their voice in leading people, right?
Yep.
So Netflix is actually a fascinating example of you saw others jump into line very, very quickly because someone stepped forward first.
Yes.
And that is actually a place where a lot of foundations, some are, and kudos to you, but for many others who are wondering, this is a place where you can really make transformational change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think right now a lot of people talk about, the head of the Nathan Cummings Foundation, Sharon Alpert, talks a lot about these times call for us to show up when it matters. And I think that's absolutely right. It's not just your resource, but it's your voice and your presence. And right now, I think a lot of people who fund on certain values, and certainly people are expecting it. So if you're a foundation and wanting to make sure people understand your social good in the world, they are expecting you to show up at these times. And so this is a great example, and certainly one that we've seen foundations do, and hopefully we'll see more of. So last one, and this is the most brilliant one I've seen recently. So for those of you that have been following, there's going to be these autonomous cars that are going to get driven around without people.
I'm looking forward to this.
This scares me to death. But what I find fascinating about it is generally with something like this that is so technologically advanced, regulation around it actually will come quite slowly. Safety standards happen very slowly. We like things to be really well tested. Now, they want to move very quickly. They've, in fact, the Association for Autonomous Industry has asked that it be moved, the regulation, from the Department of Transportation, which will be quite plotting, into the White House, which could move much more quickly under executive orders. And what's fascinating to me about it is they start off with American drivers have a deeply misplaced confidence in their ability to drive. And even as I say that, you, by the way, are not being self-reflective of your own bad habits of driving, although as a backseat driver, I can tell you are all probably horrible. But what you're remembering is somebody who recently cut you off, or your own lived experience, which is there are a lot of bad drivers out there. Like, everybody knows a bad driving experience, and by the way, it's always everybody else. So you're like, oh my God, that's totally true. So this is your lived experience. So they talk about that right now, make no mistake, we will eventually get to a self-driving future. So it's inevitable, like they have that optimism, it's called optimism bias. But every day we delay can be measured in lives lost. So they're actually letting us know that the slower we do these safety standards, we're going to lose more lives. So they're actually triggering two really important things here. They're battling short-termism, which is they're making lives lost a short-term thing that I want to get on top of right away when I hear this. They're also triggering loss aversion. So people generally don't like to lose things. So Congress is learning this lesson right now as they talk about taking Medicaid away from people, that once people get something, they really don't like to lose it. And in fact, the more you talk about the gains, the more they focus on what they're going to lose. So they can't even focus on the gains until they feel assured that the loss aversion is quite small. And you know this because when we try and change healthcare, the first thing we have to say is you can still see your doctor, right? And so this loss aversion is very important. So they are saying that we're going to lose lives every day that we wait on this. So just totally brilliant, I think, in really understanding how people's brains work to get them to think that faster safety is better. And when you think about it, that's a really hard communication challenge that they have done a very nice job navigating. So kudos to the autonomous car people. So let me pause here before we hit assessment to see if we've got any questions.
We do. Megan asks, I'm really interested in hearing more about how to address and combat people's implicit bias. So I'll take a swing at this first.
Sure.
One great resource that I would recommend to you, and they're going to be with us at Comment 17 in Miami, is the Perception Institute
I love that.
out of New York.
So good.
Fantastic organization.
Yes. So Alexis McGill, she writes, she posts. I really encourage y'all to be following the Perception Institute. They talk a lot about race and what sort of racial implicit bias is going on. So the first thing is to understand what kind of implicit bias is going on. And you see it sort of regularly. We see a lot of race. We see a lot of gender. But keep in mind that these are hard things to find out in focus groups where people are articulating things. Mostly you have to follow people around. So pay attention to the social science that is coming out where you're following people around to understand how they actually behave in real life. It's the best way to figure out what implicit bias is going on. And as far as actually holding it up to them, people will, their implicit bias when it's called out can be interrupted actually. You do have to do it in sort of gentle ways. We have found that hypocrisy is a particularly powerful one. I've been showing a lot. For those of you who've been seeing the commercials, it's actually very funny because it's for a feminine hygiene product, so I remind people that our issues are so much more important than theirs. I'm crying over this commercial. But it's all about, they ask people like, will you run like a girl? And of course they run like a girl and it's terrible.
I remember this, yeah.
And then they ask little girls to run and they run as fast as they can. And they say somewhere between being a little girl and growing up, run like a girl becomes an insult. And people who have done that, who just did it a second ago, they reflect that they in fact are part of this problem, that they hold this implicit bias. And then they ask them, would you like to run again? And it's really powerful but what it does is it allows people to have their own epiphany about it. And I just think that for implicit bias, it is one of those things you have to figure out how to bring people to understand that they're doing it so they don't get defensive. Because as soon as they get defensive, these are the people who are like, I'm not racist, I have black friends. Like, that's the implicit bias is right there, right? So, but you can't be like, well, actually, everybody's, racist. Like, that's not, like, they're going to be like, not me. Right, so now all you're talking about is, are you accusing them, as opposed to like, can you ask questions that allow them to think about things differently?
Maureen has a question here. How targeted and specialized can the cheaper data methods, so this is going back a little way, data methods get? We're in a community just outside of the metro area. I'm not sure where the metro area is. It's very different from the urban core. It's also split between rural and urban. I'm guessing most of this data is focused on the vast metro areas. So he's trying to find out how do you really dig into specific areas or some of those border areas where you might find some cross-pollination of people who fit different kinds of, I would say, demographics, but that's not quite right. Psychographics, right?
Psychographics,
They're hipsters who are living in the inner suburbs. How about that?
That's right. Well, I think the most important thing is to understand who else is actually living near you, who themselves have to know a lot about how people behave. So, like, I personally am a big fan of real estate people. No matter where you are, you have people who are real estate people. So whether they're leasing apartments or leasing houses or renting or buying, they know a lot about who's coming in, where are they choosing to live. What are things that drive them? Are they really concerned about crime? Are they really concerned about the economy? Are they concerned about can they walk places? Are they concerned about the amenities? Can you tell that they're walling themselves off? They want to live with certain types of people. And you can get this both from data that they're probably keeping track of locally, but you can also get it from somebody who's been there for a long time. So I would really encourage you to think about, so who are those people that regularly see people and see how they behave? You know, the supermarket people are always really good people. Who's coming to the supermarket? What are they buying? What time are they coming? Is it a social thing for them? Is it a fast thing for them? So I would go and find the anchor institutions of wherever you live and understand from them what data are they keeping, what anecdotes do they have for you. It's probably really valuable data. It probably takes you a little bit more time to get it. May not be as easy in data sets, but again, would be really worthwhile as you try and understand who's in your area and what's really defining them as people.
Yeah, one thing I would add on top of that, commercial real estate folks are really good at this because their job is to try to sell to businesses, so they have a really keen understanding of who the market is and who your potential buyers are. Along those same lines, a lot of places, particularly larger metro areas now, have development blogs. So in DC, I think it's DC Mud or Greater Washington. I read those things religiously, and I don't read them because I care about real estate. I read them because I'm interested in the psychology of who's going where, what they're buying, and how they're defining their neighborhoods. It's actually a fantastic way, and oftentimes the people who are running those blogs would like nothing more than to talk to somebody who's in the doing good business.
Yeah, and also finding the gathering places, like whether it's farmers markets or RV shows or, you know, different places that people gather, go, because you'll get a lot of, this is this community, these are their tribes, this is who they are, this is what they care about, and you'll see a lot of stuff at play there, even from the bumper stickers in the parking lot.
Yeah, and as you do that, you can go into things like Facebook or Google and do surveys and find that you can really hyper-localize for a very nominal amount of money and get some really good data.
Absolutely.
If you're asking the right questions.
If you're right. You need to ask the right questions. Don't just go get a bunch of data sets and then ask the questions, because you will be awash in data and it will be a frustrating experience for you.
Exactly right. All right, let's move on. Going here, right?
Yeah. All right. Wrapping this up. So I do want you to think about, well, how are you going to assess your handiwork? And again, for most of mindful messaging, you're making some pretty big assumptions. You're assuming that this is what's at play. You're assuming that this messaging will actually get you around it. And so the question is well, what feedback loops do you have in place that are telling you whether or not you were actually doing what you needed to do? So this was a great example, I thought, of people really understanding it. They wanted to get young people who were getting low grades but really wanted to play sports in college to understand that if you didn't actually get your grades up, you'd be sitting on the bench. They actually came up with a talking bench, and they took it around to schools, and kids played with it. It was huge online. So, you know, when you look at it, like, their Twitter just was imploding. But the most important thing that I was looking for, and I saw it, Leo Burnett did this campaign, it was a 680% increase to the eligibility page at NCAA. So students really understood what grades they had to get. And to me, this is what's important. To me, it was not all the metrics about Twitter, although that said, sure, you engaged people, they thought the bench was good, you made it really personal to them, you did some interesting things with your mindful messaging, but the most important thing was you actually got them to take action to understand what they had to do to play. And that, to me, is what you're looking for. So making sure that you have that. So if they didn't have a link from the bench campaign to that page, they might have missed that feedback loop. They might have had a lot of Twitter, but not been able to fingerprint all the way to the eligibility page. So I just encourage everybody to really think through how are you going to know that this is working, and then be able to evolve it based on the feedback you're getting. So just some closing thoughts here, and then we can take some last questions. I really encourage people, both for yourselves but also for your grantees, to consider mindful messaging a way to improve efforts. Hopefully I've made the big case for psychographics today. You can get them. They're not impossible. For sure, companies are way ahead of us on this, but it's out there, and it's really important. So I really encourage people to think about these psychographics that I went over and others that are out there and at play. The second is, I get a social science guru on speed dial. Like, I don't know about you, but I can only read so much social science. It's sometimes like their abstracts are even tough to read. Certainly the academic papers are tough to read. There are lots of social scientists. Mine is Annie Neiman. She's at the University of Florida. I'm giving out her address. She loves talking about this stuff. If you call her and say, this is the issue I'm working on, she will tell you the social science that's at play. University of Oregon has a ton of social scientists. So I just really encourage you to find somebody that you can talk to who's staying on the pulse of this stuff.
Yeah, and I would just add, we did a webinar on this not too long ago about how to basically befriend a social scientist, and the biggest takeaway we had was, look in your backyard, invite somebody out to coffee. You would be amazed at how often, in the same way that my wife never wants to hear what I have to say at the end of the day because it's boring, My guess is that's true for the husbands and wives who are working at your local university on this very stuff. They find somebody who's fascinated by what they do, they'll be more than happy to give you their
More than happy. Yeah, they love getting the calls. I'm just amazed at how much access I get to social scientists, and I call them and I'm like, explain to me the difference between, psychic numbing and compassion fatigue, and like, in 5 minutes I got it, and like, I don't even want to know what academic papers I would have had to read for that.
Right, yeah, could get painful pretty quickly. All right,
Yeah.
What are we looking at here?
Here is the Cognitive Bias Codex. So if you would like it bigger, you can order it as a poster for those of you, and there's some of you out there that love to diagnose yourself on WebMD when you have a cold so that you can know what really exotic disease you have. This could be for you, is that there's, like I said, there's tons out there where you can actually just have a wheel and see what kind of biases are at play. So if you want to self-diagnose, go for it. We should all be getting better at it. But it is a little easier, I will say, if you have the social scientist on speed dial. So before I say my last word, any last questions, Sean?
Yeah, looks like we have a couple here. I'm being kind of mindful of the times. We are right there. Let's see. What are your recommendations for advocacy and messaging to organizations and not just to individuals? So let's say we're the UN.
Yeah.
We want to talk to a lot of different countries. What do we do?
Yeah.
As opposed to talking to an individual.
I will tell you, you got to go to the individual, because the truth is, as soon as you said the UN, all I see is a building.
Mm-hmm.
And that building is marble and concrete and completely impervious to any of my messaging. Now, I'm really interested to know who in the UN, and you might have a lot of different individuals within the UN. But
Tribes, right?
Right. As soon as you depersonalize it, as soon as you say, I'm going after HUD, as soon as you say, I'm going after this institution, I'm going after the Chamber of Commerce,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anymore how to persuade them. But as soon as you tell me I'm going after these 3 different types at the Chamber of Commerce, and here are 3 pictures of people who represent those types,
Mm-hmm.
now I can start to do what I need to do. I can figure out what's at play. I can play with them. But really try to not depersonalize it. I find when we depersonalize it, it makes our messaging sterile. It makes it hard for us to know what's at play, because now we're just thinking about institutions and not people. And at the end of the day, communications is between people and not buildings.
Did you happen to see there was a little television station did recently where they brought everybody into the room, and there were sort of some folks who looked kind of scary and rough from my perspective. Big guys, lots of piercing tattoos, all that kind of stuff, crazy haircuts. And then some folks who looked kind of like pensioners and nice folks, and they divided themselves, and then they asked everybody, who had sex in the last 3 days? All of a sudden, a whole group of all different folks walked forward. It was fun and kind of naughty, and we all got a little chuckle out of it. But you start to recognize them. You actually start finding people where they are, where they live their lives. They don't necessarily comport with these very broad-based demographics that we're so tempted to run towards, right? That's actually probably one of our biggest biases in the sector or in this space, is to say, let me make this as binary as possible, and we're here to tell you complexity is good, embrace it. You don't have to understand it tomorrow. We're all still getting acquainted with this stuff. But the truth is, lots of organizations are way ahead of us, particularly in the for-profit space, and they understand when they're selling you soda pop or toothpaste or anything else, they aren't selling you their product, they're selling you values. They're repeating back to you your values and trying to find a way to get you to buy Crest or Coca-Cola or whatever it may be. All right, closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts here. So my big 4 takeaways are, just go deeper on psychographics. We're not spending enough time on it. We need it. In fact, our issues are better than selling toothpaste. So the truth is, this should be an area of strength for us. Second is really understand then what those biases, what those thought processes, beliefs, values, habits are at play that you need to take into account when you go do messaging. And if people can't describe for you, these are the things I'm accounting for, wait till you have that. Your messaging will be so much better. Third, you need to heed the social science. Once you know what's at play, social science will tell you this is what works to overcome that challenge, or this is what works to take advantage of that opportunity. So tons of people doing experiments out there. Why don't you go ahead and build off of what we know has been tested? And last, those feedback loops. So important to know that, oh, I thought this was going to go great. I got crickets. Okay, so figure that out and calibrate accordingly. So messaging should always be evolving. Conversations are always evolving. People's attitudes, beliefs, they're always evolving, so your messaging can't get stuck.
Right, and actually implicit in that is that the messaging you're doing has to lead to an action.
Yes.
Because it's the action that you can actually measure. People hearing it is one thing, doing something with it, something else entirely.
Yes.
All right, and this is our final slide, I think. Is that right?
And I will leave you with, you can follow me on Twitter. I regularly tweet out about the social science I am checking out or I think is particularly important to our sector. So follow me if you want, and this is where you can find mindful messaging if you want to read the report for yourself. and go to town.
All right. A couple things, guys. Before you go, and a few of you already have, there's a survey that will pop up just as we say goodbye to you. Please take it. That is our feedback loop to make sure that we did okay by you, as we're always aiming to do. Two quick things. Our next webinar coming up, speaking of soda pop, our next webinar, believe it or not, folks, is with Soda Pop. We're doing it with Coca-Cola.
Wow.
This is a really interesting thing. They've built a newsroom inside of Coca-Cola headquarters down in Atlanta, and they're going to talk about what a brand newsroom looks like. They actually cover Coca-Cola. Imagine that. And how could that look if you were working at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation or World Wildlife Fund or any number of different places. So we're going to learn a little bit about the, I was going to say the secret sauce, but I guess it's the secret formula.
That's right.
Also, I know Kristen's going to be there, but in Miami Beach at the end of September, not only will it be my 10th wedding anniversary, which I'm a lot about, but it will also be the network's annual conference, September 27th through the 29th at the Fontainebleau, which just underwent a $1 billion renovation. It's beautiful. It's right on the water. Kristen's a Florida native. She'd tell you this is the thing to do with your time. Here's the thing you need to know. We are almost out of tickets, remarkably, and it's, March now? So please sign up if you haven't already. You can do that at comnetwork.org or comnet17.org. For those of you who sent in breakout sessions, and there were nearly 100 different teams that did so, first of all, thank you. We're going to get back to you in, Emma, what is it, like 2 weeks from now? We'll be letting everybody know. Unfortunately, we only have room for 15 folks. So thank you, everybody who participated. We're going to get back to you shortly. If you want to see what we're going to do in Miami, you have to sign up. That's at comnetwork17.org. And then finally, seems like out of our 1,100 folks who make up the network, 40% of you have already logged into the brand new members community. Thank you to those folks. That means 60% of you have not. If you want to find your tribe, that's where they are. Go ahead and log on there. And if you have any questions, email Tristan, Emma, and I will get you set. Thanks very much, guys. We'll be back in about a month's time with Coca-Cola. We'll talk to you soon. Cheers.